We are really excited because we have added South Dakota State to our list of co-hosts. And so I want to first and foremost welcome Jalen Whaley and Kelly Froelich to the team for the webinar series. So that's the first order of business today. And we're going to be hearing from Kelly later as a speaker, but we're actually going to have Jalen take over as the moderator today. So you guys get the full introduction of our new co-hosts. So I'm going to turn it over to her and she can get us kicked off.
Perfect. Thanks, Melinda. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. If you're familiar with any sort of the large stock shows, you know how real stock show crud is. So we just finished the Black Hill Stock Show here in Rapid City. And I'm a little hoarse today, so hopefully everybody can hear me okay. But I just wanted to welcome everybody to the February installment of the University of Idaho, Utah State University, and now South Dakota State University Extension Sheep and Goat webinar. If you've joined any of the past webinars, you're familiar with our co-hosts, Dr. Melinda Ellison, the U of I sheep specialist, Carmen Whitmore, University of Idaho extension educator, and Chad Page, the Utah State University sheep and goat specialist. And it's my honor that we got asked to join this team. As Melinda said, I'm Jalen Whaley. I'm the South Dakota State University sheep field specialist based out of Rapid City. And my, I guess my partner in crime here in South Dakota, Dr. Kelly Froelich, who you'll hear from in a little bit, is the state small ruminant specialist over in Brookings on campus. And you'll hear more about us as you tune into the webinars. As Melinda mentioned, we will have two speakers today. And so to kick it off, it's my pleasure to welcome Michigan State small ruminant specialist, Dr. Richard Earhart, who will be discussing feeding the ewe to reduce loss at birth. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Earhart. I'll hand the stage over to you.
Hey, thanks, Jalen and Melinda and everyone for inviting me and being part of this series. And I just thought I would give a little background. I've been really interested in this topic of how to reduce loss at birth ever since I was a kid raising sheep. And that kind of led me to a research career for a while looking at this question. So I'll bring some of that into this talk today, along with hopefully some practical recommendations that you can put to use in your operation. Understanding, that we do have a lot of different production systems in the United States. I'm located in Michigan, but I'll try to make this message as universal as possible. Okay. There we go. So if we think about nutritional management, I like to call it strategic nutritional management, because if we put just the right inputs in at the right time, we can really improve our production quite a bit. We can increase the number of viable lambs or kids born for sure, with flushing and the right sort of nutrition, which I'll describe. And we can have opportunities to reduce our feeding costs by allocating, nutrition when it's really needed and making sure that we feed to the requirements and not overfeeding animals as well. We can also feed animals in a way to reduce some of the problems that you can see, such as metabolic disease issues, including things like, ketosis, twin lamb disease, and also infectious disease. That's not that link might not be as strong, but having a healthy ewe with high immunity is certainly going to ward off infectious disease issues as well. So that's another consideration. And then, also we want to increase the postnatal growth and performance of the lambs and kids. So all these things, nutritional management can achieve all these things if done properly, which I'll describe. And finally, perhaps becoming more and more in the forefront of our minds is providing a high state of welfare for the flock and herd, which is part of our responsibility as shepherds and producers. So I'll do a little background here, hopefully a little education piece here before I get to the practical information. And part of this is my natural curiosity as a former research scientist, but also I think understanding some of the background helps us consider how to manage animals more effectively. So how does maternal nutrition impact survival at birth? Well, it's kind of simple in some ways. A lot of it has to do with size at birth. Um, there are extremes, though. Very large lambs, especially, and that's mostly indicated by whether their birth type, whether they're singles, twins, or triplets. They do have a greater incidence of dystocia, so we do see, problems there. But then smaller lambs, maybe more of a common problem, would be prone to loss, mortality, because they have lower energy reserves. They have less real insulation against the cold, and they have more surface area at the body mass. Also, besides size at birth, we need to consider colostrum supply. That plain nutrition that the animals receive, particularly energy nutrition, in the last even short period of time before birth, say 10 to 14 days, makes a pretty big impact on colostrum supply. So you want to make sure you optimize that so you don't have problems with survival. That isn't a limiting factor for survival at birth. And it sounds like Kelly's going to talk about colostrum. So I'm not really going to focus too much on colostrum here as a subject, but it is certainly impacted by maternal nutrition. And then another thing that people often miss is that nutrition impacts maternal behavior. Underfed animals just do not take as good a care of their lambs, and that's been shown again, different studies over time. And so that's another factors too. So yeah, as I said, small and large lambs are at the greatest risk. You can see a lot of discordance or variation in birth size, even within a litter. These lambs were from the same litter, for example. So here's, the classic U-shaped curve people talk about, where we have birth size shown here, and we have survival probability. Survival probability is lower at both ends. It goes down, particularly with the small guys, but the bigger guys too. This is mostly dystocia problems, right? And this is generally probably starvation exposure, or possibly, lambs that are entangled because they're high order multiples. So the optimal birth weight is somewhere in here. We don't want to be on either extreme. This is more controlled. The movement from here to here is controlled by nutrition pretty strongly. So large lambs, I'll call them neonates here. Sorry for the fancy word, but that covers both sheep and goats. All right. So large lambs or kids frequently fall victim to dystocia. And that's a more common problem in first parity ewes or does. Those lambs for the first time, ewes and dolings, ewe lambs and dolings, and they often aren't fully grown. So that's more of an issue there. Not so much of an issue in sheep as compared to cattle with mature, parity 2, 3, 4, 5 older animals. And small guys frequently succumb to lack of oxygen, or fancy word is hypoxia, during late fetal life. And those that born alive are at a much greater risk of starvation exposure. So these smaller lambs and kids will tend to be prone to, may be stillborn, even may die in the birth process. So what determines size at birth? I've always been curious about this, and my research, and not my research, but the body of research, and I've contributed to it in some ways, has shown very strongly that the placenta, that tissue that supports fetal life, is really a key determinant. And in fact, the size of the placenta really is what determines fetal size at birth. And really, and you think about it next, placental size is influenced by litter size. So if you have 3 lambs occupying a uterus versus 1, they have so many additional points of attachment. The way sheep and goats and cattle, all their uterus is set up, they have these attachment points called caruncles. There's only so many caruncles in a uterus. In a sheep, there may be, say, 150. If you're single, you might get the vast majority of those. If you're a triplet, you might get a third of those. So you end up with a much smaller size of placenta. So each of those individual attachment points, add them all up, that's the size of the placenta. So small triplets are always smaller compared to singles and triplets, given everything else the same. So fetal genotype can make a difference as well, less well understood, but certainly studies have shown that. And then placental size can be influenced by a number of factors outside of just litter size. Nutrition has some impact, has to be very severe though. Generally, placental size isn't impacted by nutrition that much, but heat can make a difference. So if animals are exposed to high heat environments, which they typically aren't and this would have to be during mid-pregnancy only when the tissue is growing its fastest, you can have a stunted lambs as a result. So you get smaller placentas, smaller lambs. Typically, that's a problem only in lambs that are being born late summer, early fall, right? Because that's when it might be hot during mid-pregnancy. So not so much of a problem in many of our production systems. In Australia, places like that, where they might lamb in the fall in a Mediterranean type climate, or perhaps in California, you might see a greater incidence of this small size due to heat. Probably not in most of our systems though. And then finally, maternal nutrition is a big deal. So not only is the size of the placenta important, but how much nutrition is available to pass through the placenta, right? So that's especially important in the last 30 days of pregnancy. The nutrient requirements of the fetus, like, what it needs to survive, are pretty much you can't even quantify them until you get past day 90 or so of pregnancy. And they're pretty small until day 110. So it's that critical last month of pregnancy that becomes the most important window to feed the animals well. So that's important in understanding how to allocate your feed resources. Most of us know that, but I just want to reinforce that. Just a picture of a lamb here at a young age before what you see here, the number of these attachment points called cotyledons. These are separated from the uterine surface in this case, but those, you add all those up and that's actually constitutes the placenta. So what does this look like in terms of growth of these tissues? Just to give you a sense of what happens over time. So here we have that last 30 days. That's where most of this fetal growth is occurring, right? This last bit. This is about 110 days right in here, I think. Oops. And that last period of time is when things are really growing. You see a big separation in the growth trajectory or growth rates of singles and triplets during mid-pregnancy. Early in pregnancy, nutrition makes very little difference. You don't see much separation, but it's right about here that the combined effects of placental size, triplets have much smaller placentas, and maternal nutrition, which can become limiting in these guys, have their effect and it's manifest as changes in fetal weight. So small lambs are at a high risk for starvation exposure for a number of reasons. First of all, they have lower, energy reserves. And a lamb, as I'll show you, really is born with very small energy reserves. They don't have much glycogen. They don't have something called brown fat at a very high level. The only fat they have is brown fat, but it's pretty scant. They're born very lean compared to other animals. So they need colostrum, as Kelly will tell you pretty quickly. We can also have impaired regulation of heat production as a result of being small. And they always have the physics are such that they have a higher surface area to mass ratio. And interestingly, you may know this if you raise fine wool sheep, especially, but they do have a sparser wool coat. So if they're undernourished, they have impaired follicle development and they tend to have sparser wool coat. I see this, even our sheep that are very prolific, have twins, triplets, quads. We see that the triplets and quads are born with far less wool coat, than some of the larger singles and twins. So here's just a picture of a lamb that succumbed to, in this case, I think it was just a stillborn lamb, didn't starve. But even in a lamb like this, that's got lots of the maximum energy reserves, it died at birth. None of his reserves were used up. You just see a small amount of brown fat under the scapula. It's this kind of tan colored tissue here under the shoulder blades. If I were to open up this lamb, you'd see a larger amount around the kidneys and heart. That's pretty much what they have to run on until they drink their first colostrum. So some more consequences of poor nutrition are poor colostrum yield, as I mentioned, and poor maternal behavior, which I also alluded to already. So if we add all this up, being born small does definitely put you at greater risk for starvation exposure, death to hypothermia. You have sparser coat, you have less body fat, you have a greater higher amount of surface area to heat production. You have low energy reserves. And because you were born small and your placenta was kind of small, there's a good chance you were you could have been limited on an oxygen delivery, because the tissue delivers the same thing. It delivers oxygen as well as nutrients, of course. And then if your mother was not well fed, all these things come into play. She's going to have less colostrum. She's not going to be as good of a mom. She might walk away from her lambs at birth. As a matter of fact, I've seen underfed ewes do that just to get a bite to eat. All these contribute to an exaggerated heat loss and lack of heat production, if you will. You can also have other factors that can come into play too, which are somewhat related, or less tightly related to size, which is difficult birth, or dystocia is this fancy term for that. They'll have reduced suckling drive, they might have damage to their central nervous system, and they might be lacking oxygen. So they might not have the capacity to mount a heat response as well. And then throw on top of that all the environmental factors, and these are all the things that contribute to this incidence of starvation exposure. But size at birth is a really big part of it, and a lot of that is explained by maternal nutrition. So I would contest that relatively small investments in improved nutritional management can play large benefits. There's a big return on investment here. You can improve your ovulation rate quite a lot by flush. Excuse me. By flushing ewes, by feeding them, as I'll describe. You can improve embryo survival by feeding them the proper plane of nutrition. And you can improve colostrum yield and performance. And so these are all things I'll discuss. So in understanding nutritional status, it's important to monitor your system and your sheep. And most of you probably know how to do this, but I just give a quick review. And that helps you fine tune your feeding plan as well. So, we can come up with the most refined feeding plan, but sometimes we kind of we really do need to monitor our animals to make sure all of our estimates, if you will, of what they're eating are actually real. Sometimes there's things that we can't quite quantify. So actually looking at their body condition is really important. So body condition scores, as you probably know, are in sheep are basically go from 1 to 5. I tend to use quarter scores because I think that's pretty blunt. The difference between a 1, 2, and 3 is huge. It's almost 10 to 15 pounds per condition score. So condition scoring is pretty simple. You probably know how to do this already, but you just basically look at you feel the spine, or the transverse and lateral processes of the spine here, right at the loin. And you get an idea of how much, basically it's mostly fat, but you're also perceiving some muscle tone as well. And, so a condition score 1 is going to feel like the back of your knuckles. Condition score 2 is like the back of your knuckles. Condition score 1, you should really never see. Condition score 2 would be like the back of your fingers here. You can determine the vertebrae, but they're blunt. And condition score 4 would be you can barely feel any vertebrae at all. They're like the back of your hand here. Okay. So that's a pretty simple indicator. Here's some sheep that are in good body condition. They're all 3.5s probably. I don't know if there's a 4 in there, but they're approaching that. They're in really good shape. Here's a ram, for example. It's a little hard to perceive maybe, but you can see his spine, his hip bones. He's condition score 2 most likely. So the stage of production dictates the nutrient requirements, as you probably know, and I'll just go over those quickly. I'll break them into a few chapters here, and we'll talk about the relevant ones for this talk. We have the flushing or pre-breeding period, which impacts ovulation rate. We have early pregnancy, which I'm going to define as that first trimester, which impacts embryo survival. Then we have mid-pregnancy, which is this period of it's not as active a period in our perception, but there's an important process really when the placenta, as I've described, grows like gangbusters. And then late pregnancy is when fetal growth and development occur in a mass, in a large sense. Colostrum supply is impacted then, and mammary development as well, all by nutrition. So that last trimester, last 30, 40, 50 days are a real critical window for that as well. And then we have early lactation and late lactation, which I'm not going to focus on for this talk. So here's just a description of the energy requirements for ewes raising twins, for example. For goats, it's really not very different. At least the absolute amounts would be different, of course, but the general idea remains the same. This would be in an annual production system, so I'm showing over a year here. If you're doing a shorter production system, you'd eliminate this dry period. But we can see here, starting, let's say these animals are given birth here right about 150, at 150 days, of course, 145, 50 days. We see that, this flushing requirement is about double the requirement of mid-pregnancy. So the requirement mid-pregnancy is much lower. We get a jump up again in late pregnancy, and then lactation's higher yet. Most of the increase in energy in nutrition of lactation comes from an increase in voluntary intake. One of the things about late pregnancy is the animals can only eat so much. So that's why we have to have a pretty rich diet, as I'll describe in late pregnancy. I've also superimposed some body condition score targets on here, ranging from 275 to 375 here. But you can see we'd like to keep those animals in a relatively tight range, in that sort of sub 3 to 3.5 range, and higher or lower depending on the stage of production. And I'll describe some of that in a minute. So I'll start off with flushing or pre-breeding. What we know, and the reason why I talk about this in relation to size at birth is, really nutritional management of pregnancy starts before pregnancy, starts right here, because that sets the tone for how many, the stage for how many lambs and kids are born. So both short-term and long-term nutrition play a role in ovulation rate. Just increasing nutrition for about 2 to 3 weeks prior to ram introduction or buck introduction makes a big difference, but also the body condition score at the beginning of that period also has a role. So that's more of a long-term effect. We found that feeding close to 200% maintenance gives a really potent effect. And then we like to bring this diet down to a maintenance level. First of all, I kind of went through that quickly. What is maintenance? Maintenance is just the amount of food that keeps an animal maintaining its weight. Okay, so they need to eat about twice as many groceries or twice as many calories compared to weight maintenance for this flushing effect. They need to gain some weight. They need to gain, say, 5 to 10 pounds in this period. Basically, their brain needs to think that they're well fed, so they have more, they ovulate at a higher rate. We see increases of, in our studies, we see in the low 30s, but 25% is pretty common response. And ewes and does don't respond if they're very fat. So that makes it less important if you have fat animals. I find that this isn't a real common situation in most production systems, but in certain ones you can, and you might not get a big response if your animals are, say, over a condition score 3.5. You can do this flushing program in a number of ways. Many people will use some grain, but even high quality forages can give this response. The trick is just to make sure that you get this response, you get this weight increase. There's different ways of achieving it. Then in early pregnancy, it's a period of implantation or placentation. This is when this placenta gets established, the embryo gets implants into the uterus, and this placentation occurs. And basically, you don't want these animals to lose weight. You also don't want to feed them the flushing diet well into this period, because there's studies that have shown that overfeeding animals can also have negative consequences in terms of embryo retention. So you want them, you give them a bunch of extra nutrition just before ram turn-in, then you feed them maybe just above maintenance requirements during the breeding period and all the way until late pregnancy, which is pretty much what I described here. And so in mid-pregnancy, again, this is a period of rapid placental growth. As I mentioned, heat can make a difference, but nutrition doesn't make a very big difference, maybe contrary to some people's understanding. mostly the placental size is going to make a pretty big difference in determining size of the lambs. But another kind of curious fact is and it might be helpful for you to appreciate, is that the size of the placenta also determines the size of placental or mammary development. Sorry, there's hormones that are produced by the placenta that determine the extent of mammary development in a particular pregnancy. So if a ewe is going to have triplets this pregnancy, she's going to have a certain amount greater hormone production. She's going to have that much more milk. The same ewe, her next lambing period, say she has a single, she always has less mammary development. Why is that? It's because she has smaller placenta and she has therefore less hormone production to produce milk. So that helps you understand like what a ewe's potential for milk is. Moderate undernutrition, actually, underfeeding during this period has been shown to have very little effect on fetal growth as long as animals are well fed in late pregnancy. So, this can be a time that's more forgiving where you can have animals on, winter pasture or different production system opportunities like that where you might lower your feed costs. This might be a time where you can kind of economize a little bit in your feeding system. But you have to make sure if you do lose a little bit of weight that you make sure you feed them well in late pregnancy so you don't have any negative effects. So as far as feeding systems go, generally early and mid pregnancy, we'll have in many sheep and goat farms, we're going to be grazing these animals. But if they're a confinement system, you would have them on low or moderate quality forage, probably limit feeding it even. And especially if they're high quality forages, you're going to want to limit feed them. Your animals are probably going to get too fat. It's important to have free access to trace mineralized salt made for your particular sheep or goat program. I can't really get as specific as I'd like in that because this is a national webinar or it's mostly in the Western states. So I'd have different requirements to recommend for your area than I probably would for mine. But it is important to meet their trace mineral requirements, most certainly. We're very selenium deficient here where you aren't in many parts of the West, so it's a little hard for me to make a blanket statement there. But we're going to adjust our energy intake based on our target. So generally, we don't want those animals to dip below a 2.5, so we got to make sure we maintain that level of nutrition. Here's the picture of some sheep I used to manage in New York State. We would graze them on winter pasture where they dig through the snow during mid-pregnancy without any problem. But we have to make sure we bring them in around 30 days before lambing and get them shorn and put them on better feed. And they do great. They'd have twins and triplets pretty nicely and take good care of them. But they would be maintained on a pasture like this during their after ram introduction all the way up until then. For late pregnancy, it's important to understand that a ewe is going to prioritize her fetal tissues actually over her own. So if you don't feed an animal well in late pregnancy, they will partition a lot of nutrients to the developing lambs and kids. They're going to lose body condition, and that's a problem. So the lambs and kids might not be, they're going to be a little smaller, but like the ewe or doe can do a pretty good job of compensating. But the negative there is that she's going to be low in fat, low in body reserve. She's not going to milk as well. She may also be prone to ketosis if it's severe enough undernutrition. And you can get smaller lambs, most certainly, if the nutrition is sustained and hard and long enough. So we need to provide some, generally for prolific animals, those are having twins, let's say, and greater, we're usually going to need some energy supplementation to meet those needs. They're going to need to eat about twice maintenance or even a little bit more for triplets. The dams carrying singles, goats or sheep, doesn't matter, have much lower requirements. They're going to need some extra groceries then as well, but not nearly as much. So that argues for maybe grouping these animals if you can according to litter size. Most of us don't have the capacity to do this, but those who do ultrasound and fetal counts can do that. Overseas, that's a pretty common practice, actually. If you go to Australia, especially, they will separate their multiples from their singles because that's the way they can save a lot of feed resources. They've got ultrasound technicians that do this pretty successfully. One other consideration in late pregnancy is that we need to understand that our animals are going to have limited intake capacity, particularly if they've got twins and triplets inside them like these ewes do. So they have high energy needs. They have their capacity for feed intake is limited. So we need to have richer diets, therefore, right? So these ewes like this, or pretty much any ewes, doesn't matter what breed or type they are, they're not going to eat generally more than 3% of their body weight on a dry matter basis during this time. Okay, so say they're a 200-pound ewe, that's 6 pounds of dry matter. They're going to increase that to 8 to 10 pounds in early lactation, but they're limited in their intake for different reasons, physical and metabolic reasons. So understanding that's important. So you have to feed them a pretty rich diet. It can involve grazing. So these are sheep about to give birth on pasture. They're not fed any supplements, but they're consuming some really lush pasture that's very digestible. And so this is maintaining their non-pregnant body weight just fine. But it's if they're raising triplets, probably not quite good enough. But it's but in most of our stored feeding systems where you're feeding stored feed, you're not going to have forage quality as high as this. You're going to need to consider feeding some concentrate. So what about protein? I get asked about protein a fair bit. I've talked about energy up to this point in a fairly blunt way. I did some work a long time ago with a colleague, David McNeil at Cornell, where we looked at the protein needs of sheep in late pregnancy. We fed them either a low protein diet, 8%, a medium protein diet, 11.5%, or a high protein diet. And we looked at the amount of protein, or nitrogen is the same proxy for protein, in both maternal tissues and pregnant uterus. And we found that that animals that were underfed, did lose protein in their maternal tissues. But what were these tissues, and how did this work? So let's look at the next slide. Here we have the protein changes in maternal tissues. And looking at it, this level is gives you a lot better clue. So you see that low protein animals definitely, this is for the 30-day period, they're underfed protein, adequate energy, but low protein. They definitely lost protein from their muscle. Even the medium protein diet. So this is around what NRC recommends. It's actually just a little bit lower for twins. And these animals also lost protein, but they did gain, obviously, protein in the mammary gland, in their internal organs. So their heart, their intestines, their liver, their heart, all these organs increased in mass a little bit, as they typically do in late pregnancy. And we didn't see any change in wool due to protein, which is pretty well buffered. But we did see, so it kind of begs the question is, what is the ideal amount of protein to feed? Do you want your animals to lose a little bit of protein from their skeletal muscle? This is kind of what the recommendations had been. Or would you like them to gain protein, as you've shown here at 16%? My feeling is it's probably better to have it somewhere in the middle. So I suggest around 13% protein. This is expensive. It's probably too much. And what is, the benefit of having this extra protein in muscle? It could be to make some extra milk, but it might be at a cost. So I'd say fetal growth is going to be optimized at a protein level of about 11% for singles and 13% for twins, based on this work and others. But supplemental protein above that threshold may have some benefit in certain production systems. Might produce a little more milk, but that remains to be seen. That's sort of speculative. And was this going to be cost effective? That would be the question I'd need to ask right away, right? Probably isn't, would be my guess, but I haven't done the work. So as far as the nutritional targets of late pregnancy, I kind of summarized them here. These are concentrations in diets, not absolute amounts, because we assume you're going to try to hit about an unlimited feed intake of about, so they're going to eat around 3%. If you're feeding them at 3%, here's what the concentration of energy in terms of total digestible nutrients and crude protein should look like. For their litter size. Okay, so triplets, you need to feed them a fairly rich diet to pack those groceries into that 3% intake that they have. And singles, actually, you can feed a surprisingly lower quality diet and meet their needs pretty well. They're more like beef cattle. Okay, they don't need nearly the same degree of supplementation as more prolific animals. Just to remind you, micronutrient supplementation is important, although I'm not going to talk about it in detail because it varies so much, but there are a few blanket statements I feel I can make, and that is that vitamin E supplementation, especially when feeding stored forage or actually any fat soluble vitamins. So fat soluble vitamins would include vitamin A, D, E, and K. They're all going to be low in any stored forage, even if it looks really green. As soon as you kill that plant, dry it up, or even put it in silage, you'll lose a lot of the fat soluble vitamin content. So investigators all the way from Montana to the Great Britain have shown that you can improve birth weight and lamb survival by giving pretty high levels of vitamin E, higher than what you typically think would be requirements. So the requirements, if you look in the NRC 2007, are a pretty high level of vitamin E for that last 30 days to the pregnant ewe. That ends up being about 2.2 IUs per pound of body weight. So it's about 300 IUs for your typical sheep. And it costs about 50 cents to give that, at least it did. And I should be a little careful. Vitamin E levels cost has gone up a little bit over time, but it's probably less than $1 of supplement per ewe, which can be a good investment. Selenium is very important. You may or may not be adequate, but you got to make sure that you are. If you're not, you're going to run into white muscle disease. Iodine in our part of the world can be limiting as well. So we need to make sure we meet those needs. We have plenty of lambs born with enlarged thyroids or goiters that aren't supplemented right. So as far as the feeding program goes, I'll just give you some kind of recommendations here and we'll try to wrap it up. One, reserve our best high energy, most digestible hays or silages for late pregnancy. So if you got an inventory you're managing, reserve those highly digestible ones for late pregnancy and into lactation also, and feed those during the late pregnancy period. Make sure you don't neglect the micronutrient status or levels. That's when you see animals most sensitive to deficiency or newborns. So probably the best indicator of a nutritional deficiency for micronutrients, whether it be vitamins or minerals, would be in the newborn lamb. That's when they show up. That's when we see goiters. We might have iodine deficiency in a flock, but we don't see it in the adults. We see it in the newborns, and they have poor survival rates and large thyroids and all that sort of thing. In a component feeding system, what I mean by that is one where you feed hay and grain separately, which many producers do, as opposed to a total mixed ration, which larger farms would do. A simple rule of thumb is to feed concentrate at sort of 1/2 to 1 pound per lamb or kid expected during this late pregnancy period. You need to adjust this based on your forage quality. You might be at the higher or low end of this range, and the activity, temperature of the animals as well, or the temperature of the environment and the activity as well. Pasture-based systems usually aren't going to need this, or doesn't really work in a pasture-based system because often forage quality is going to be high because you dictate like lambing on pasture or kidding on pasture with high forage quality, hopefully. But you will have deficits in your triplets and quads. They just can't overcome them in a pasture-based system, which kind of begs the question of whether you should be raising those animals on pasture or not, I guess. And then just another little piece, which I didn't talk about, but I'll just bring in quickly, is if you're feeding in a more confinement system, like we do some parts of the upper Midwest here in the East, we will need to consider parasites like coccidia, which are protist that affects lambs and kids quite in a quite intense way if they're not protected. So we'll need to consider some feeding of coccidiostats in late pregnancy to minimize this problem. That you can pretty much eliminate coccidiosis from your health concerns if in a confinement system, if you feed coccidiostat in late pregnancy at the right level. Many of your systems aren't going to need that, but a confinement system most surely will. So in summary, just to wrap it up here, adequate energy provision in late pregnancy is going to improve survival at birth. You're going to improve birth size. give greater energy reserves and vigor to those lambs and kids. You're going to have greater, and the moms are going to take better care of their offspring. The keys to providing this energy are to know your forage quality. That means the energy content, which is dictated by fiber digestibility. This wasn't necessarily meant to be a nutrition lesson, but there's important measures of fiber, like neutral detergent fiber, you should be monitoring in your feed, and the digestibility of that NDF or neutral detergent fiber. Those are all key factors. Knowing litter size is certainly helpful, or at least having a sense for it, so you feed to a target litter size. Monitoring body condition and decreasing feed accordingly. And in prolific sheep, prolific sheep and goats, you're going to need to consider some concentrate feeding, but you can't just do it with concentrates alone. You can't just take a bunch of straw and add corn to it. You need to have some decent forage to match so that you minimize problems with acidosis and things of that nature. Monitor body condition throughout the production cycle. So you want to make sure you hit a level above 2.5 in early pregnancy. In mid-pregnancy, you'd like to keep them sort of in this intermediate range. In late pregnancy, if you could, you'd like to see them increase their body condition just a little bit so that they have adequate reserves, because it's hard when they give birth for them to eat to their milk production levels, so they tend to lose weight. So we'd like to bank just a little extra energy and protein during that period. And then we need to monitor a micronutrient status of forages and feeds to make sure they're met, and make sure that we consider fat soluble vitamins. If you have problems with these, you could consider, and you're seeing a high degree of lamb loss or weak lambs at birth, and you're concerned about micronutrient status, I would suggest working with your extension folks and your veterinarians to see if you can collect some fetal tissues and get them analyzed to see where you're sitting. So that's what I have for today's talk. Glad to answer, I guess, some questions if there's time, or whatever you guys think is appropriate. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Hart. I think that was really great. There are quite a few questions.
Okay.
The first one is, when extremely cold temps in early to mid pregnancy, should higher quality hay be provided, or keep it less quality feed during that time? So I guess questions on cold stress maybe.
Yeah, so I think the important thing is to monitor the energy reserve. So if the animals during really cold periods, I think cold is sometimes, I guess it depends. Animals that are maintained outside in cold and wind with higher temperature loss really do seem to need extra calories. So we've got some producers in northern Michigan, for example, that outwinter their ewes and keep them. They're under a bit of a windbreak perhaps, but that's about it. And they're expecting a 200% lamb crop, and they have to feed a good 30% more to their use during that mid-pregnancy period to make sure they don't have problems. So you do need to monitor, otherwise they'll lose weight. So I guess the key is just making sure you're meeting their requirements. Their maintenance requirements go up, if you will, quite a bit when they're in the cold. Yeah.
Thank you. Another participant asked, could you add molasses, like 1/4 of a pound daily in late gestation, to supply the energy needed if you're grass fed?
Yeah. So I guess the question is, molasses will provide some energy. It's a very expensive form of energy. But I suppose if you have a grass-fed protocol that says, I can feed molasses, but not grain, that could be an energy supplement, but it isn't nearly as effective as feeding some starch and grain. So a 1/4 pound probably wouldn't hurt, but won't make a huge impact. Probably won't be enough to meet the requirements of triplets, for example, but certainly would help a little bit if that's the only opportunity you have to increase energy levels, but certainly not the most cost-effective way of doing it. And, probably not quite as good for the digestive health of the animal either, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any insight into the nutrition level impacts on multiple births where one is large and the others are small, kind of like the picture that you showed?
Yeah, that's mostly, unfortunately, cooked into the books of the size of the placenta. And, so you might see a little less, I'll call it variation or discordance, change in size if they're well fed. But a lot of that has to do with when those embryos first enter the uterus, like when they're created. If one of the guys happens to get there a little slower than his brother or sister, he's going to have fewer attachment sites. And that's mostly what explains those really big differences in size. One lamb or kid might occupy 80 of those attachment points because he got there 3 hours quicker. And the other guys might just have very much fewer attachment points. So that isn't impacted by nutrition as much as you might originally think. Yeah, it's mostly kind of random chance of development.
Great. I guess kind of along that line then, for the certain breeds of sheep that are known for being very prolific, are those breeds more successful because of the increased caruncles or placental development?
Yeah, that's a pretty insightful question. I do believe that I don't know if anyone's really evaluated that carefully, okay? But I would say there's a good chance that there are more attachment sites in like a Finn compared to a Chevy at U. But that's a great question. I do think that there is a literature on that. I don't have my fingers on the numbers right now, but it might not be, it doesn't explain everything, but I do think there is some compensation in the more prolific breeds. There's probably other compensatory factors like these, like each of these attachment points there's some plasticity in how they grow too that's not well understood, but the number certainly might be influenced by the breed. And I'm guessing, yes, more prolific breeds might have a few more. And that's a great question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good question. When is the best time to give a vitamin E and selenium paste supplement?
My feelings on vitamin E and selenium would be to continually, if you've got a system that allows you to feed those, it's usually cheaper and more effective. So the levels build up over time. If I were to give a single supplement, I don't know if that would be adequate to raise the levels like you'd want, but I think you would want to do it at least, 2 to 3 weeks before the sheep give birth, maybe that day 110 to 120 days. But I think it'd be much more effective if you could give them a lower level, like in their feed, or even some people put vitamin E in the mineral of sheep, and that's another way to deliver it.
Perfect, thank you. Let's see. The questions just keep flowing in.
It's good.
Yeah. So going back to our lambs being too large, can feeding higher protein lead to lambs that are too large? This producer is using a distiller's grain that's pretty high protein.
Probably not. I think it's more total calories. I don't think a high protein diet's going, because most of that extra protein isn't going to result in bigger lambs. It's just going to be, deaminated, or, it's not going to result, because that's not, the energy is more of a limiting factor actually for size at birth. Protein, within reason. So I don't think that's going to make a big difference. It's a tough one, telling a producer to limit feed their ewe lambs is tricky. I think because that's when you have the problem with large lambs. It's mostly in, first parity, like young ewes that aren't fully mature yet. What would be the best, of course, is if you could get a fetal number on those ewes and feed those singles a little bit less than the ones that have twins and triplets. That would be the best for that, but I know that's not practical for everybody. But short of that, it's a tough one to manage. I'll honestly have to say, honestly. Yep.
Yeah, and could you elaborate a little bit on what you meant by like limit feeding? Someone had asked a question that they'd been told to feed a little bit less the last 2 weeks on some Nigerian dwarf does.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but I will. Yeah, limit feeding just means simply defined, not letting them eat all they can eat, right? So, if you feed them all they can eat, they'll eat to their voluntary intake. For a lot of sheep at maintenance, like if they have good quality, if you're feeding them pretty good quality feed, you might only be feeding them like a third to a half of what they want to eat. So that might be something you need to do to meet a maintenance need with really good feed. On the other hand, if you've got some pretty poor quality feed, you could probably let them have unlimited access to it and just barely meet their maintenance requirements too. So it has a lot to do with their feed quality as to the degree of limit that you would impose on an animal. So it's a little hard for me to maybe answer that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So there's several questions in here also on kind of what your definition of low or moderate quality forages versus high quality.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit on that? Maybe some of your TDN, ADF, and NDF.
Okay, yeah, I could try. So let's say high quality forages are going to be TDNs above 60. They're make over 65 unless you got really amazing stuff. The NDF levels are a little trickier to describe because they vary a lot compared to grass or legume content of forages. But like you wouldn't like if it's a more of a grass-based forage, you'd want it less than say 52. A legume-based forage less than 40. For protein levels, good quality forages, again, it's going to vary a lot depending on this grass or legume-based forage, but I'd like to see a good grass forage is going to be above 13. A good legume-based forage is going to be above 16 probably. So those would be some considerations. A medium quality forage is going to be in that 55 to 60 range. And I say poorer quality forages are going to, of TDN, are going to be less than 55 and correspondingly higher NDF and ADF levels. I know I just threw a bunch of numbers at you. It might not be meaningful, but you kind of asked me to do that, so I did my best. But if you have some specific questions on that, like if you sent me a forage report, and I could tell you good, bad, or ugly pretty fast, yep. And I did put my contact slide up here. I don't know if you saw that. If you'd like to follow up, I'm glad to follow up with any of these questions via email, especially.
Yeah, there's several pretty specific ones in here.
Okay. Yep.
But talking on kind of that legume-based versus grass-based, someone asked, is alfalfa preferable in late gestation to other forage types, such as something like orchard grass or something like that?
I would say it's mostly about forage quality. You might tend to see some higher quality forages being alfalfa, not always. So I know I'm not trying to evade the question here. Generally, alfalfa, the way it's harvested, you tend to get a little better quality over a larger range of maturity. But on the other hand, if you have orchard grass and you harvest it at like a fairly, moderate maturity or earlier maturity before it seeds out, it can be really good stuff too. So I would say, actually, if I had a choice and I had really good alfalfa forage, I would tend to push it towards lactation because it has naturally higher protein levels. And if I had some really high quality mixed grass legume hay, that had high energy, so at high TDN, like above 55 or in that 60 range, and maybe had moderate protein, like 13%, that might be perfect for leg pregnancy. So you got kind of a high energy, moderate protein feed, and you save the best, highest protein for lactation. But you above all, you do make sure you meet the energy needs of late pregnancy. So you might end up wasting a little protein, but if you had a chance to buy something a little different or procure something a little different or feed them differently, you could save some of that protein for lactation.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you've looked into some of this a little bit, but somebody was asking, will winter grazing cover crops provide quality nutrition as opposed to hay?
If you look over my shoulder here in my picture here, that's what these sheep are doing. And these sheep are being fed a cover crop. It's a bunch of turnips and radishes. They're grazing it through the snow and they're gaining weight. So it's almost, I wouldn't say it's too good of nutrition, but these ewes are outside in the winter. They need a little more energy and protein, or a little more energy, especially. So cover crops could, as long as they have access to them, the snow's not too deep, and all of these factors are considered, they can provide some excellent nutrition. In fact, we could take these ewes pretty close to lambing. I wouldn't recommend taking them too close to lambing on the kind of feed that you see in that picture behind my whatever pick in my video here. Yeah. And also, like this feed that you see, I don't know if you can still see this picture here behind me. This isn't a cover crop, but this is some stockpiled rape that I planted on a farm here in Michigan in July, and I'm grazing it in November, December here, and it's like 4 feet tall. So this is like really good feed. This would almost meet the needs of late pregnancy. But so those certainly are options. Not everyone has those. It depends on the farming system, but yeah, they can make great feed resources.
Perfect. Well, we'll just take one more. I think this one, I've heard this one be asked several different times, but does the feeding time affect the time for delivery? Sometimes they say that feeding late in the morning or early in the afternoon will help alter when those ewes lamb. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I guess it depends on your feeding system. Most of us, like a lot of us, are feeding fairly. You might see it more of an impact if you're truly feeding like a large single diet once a day. I'm probably not the best person to ask that question to. There is a literature on that. I think there is some impact, but in my personal experience, I haven't seen a real strong, tight impact of it in the way I feed my animals. But you'll find producers really swear by it. They'll say, we feed a certain time of day and we tend to get a concentrated drop 6 hours or something later. If I don't know if Jalen, if you have any thoughts on that, because I can't really speak to that from personal experience myself, but I know that there is some, maybe if it's folklore or truth, I'm not sure, but there is something that people like to talk about, right?
Yeah, no, I would agree with you. I definitely am not one to speak overly thoroughly on it, but
Yeah.
With my experience, we haven't seen quite the impact either. But like you said, I've heard producers that swear by it.
Yeah.
So I know I didn't get to everybody's questions. So if you have questions that you really want answered, feel free to email Dr. Earhart or one of us. But thank you for your time, Dr. Earhart. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah.